The Rust Belt Tavern smelled like spilled years and cheap mistakes. It was a sensory attack of stale beer, fryer grease that had oxidized into a sticky lacquer on the walls, and the desperate, futile attempt of industrial disinfectant to mask the scent of human failure. Neon signs, half dead, buzzing with the insistence of trapped wasps, cast a sickly, fluctuating orange light across the worn linoleum floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the humid air like tiny, desperate ghosts. In the farthest booth, tucked against a wall that felt suspiciously damp, sat invisibility incarnate. She was a silhouette defined by camouflage, oversized dark hoodie pulled low, the fabric swallowing the contours of her face. Her boots were worn leather, heavy and scuffed, the kind that had seen purposeful mileage rather than fashionable wear. She nursed a single glass of well bourbon, neat, the amber liquid catching the weak light, untouched for the last 20 minutes. Beside the glass, a heavily annotated copy of Military Logistics and the Failure of Supply Lines rested open, its spine cracked, pages dog-eared with practiced intent. She didn't look up. She didn't check her phone. She existed purely within the radius of her drink and the dense text, an island of stillness in a sea of manufactured noise. The noise, tonight, was centered around the pool table, specifically around a figure radiating the kind of aggressive confidence that only comes from newly minted rank and zero operational experience. Lieutenant Vance. He wasn't subtle. Everything about him was loud. His laughter too booming, his uniform shirt, casually unbuttoned but meticulously pressed, signaling he was off duty, but wanted everyone to know he was something. Too starched. His watch, too expensive. He was surrounded by a small gravitational field of hangers-on, mostly junior enlisted types eager to bask in the reflected glory of perceived authority. They were shouting jokes about training exercises, using jargon incorrectly, and generally poisoning the air with their self-congratulation. They hadn't earned the right to be this loud, and everyone in the bar who actually had earned quiet respect knew it. And Reynolds, though no one in the tavern knew her name, much less her rank, was the recipient of their careless disregard. Vance and his acolytes used the narrow strip of floor by her booth as their personal thoroughfare, bumping her table repeatedly. Each jolt was minor, a deliberate dismissive tremor designed to interrupt the peace of the lonely girl in the corner. She registered the first bump not as an accident, but as a pressure test. Her grip on the bourbon glass tightened imperceptibly, not enough to shatter the glass, but enough to register the friction against the crystalline surface. Her eyes, beneath the shadow of the hood, remained locked on the dense text, tracking the analysis of 19th century Prussian movements. But the focus was peripheral. The true surveillance was centered on the vibrations entering her chair, mapping the rhythm and proximity of the threat. Vance, emboldened by the lack of reaction, escalated. He was talking about a recent field evaluation, loudly criticizing the soft skill sets of the support personnel, unaware that the quiet woman he was ignoring was the exact kind of support personnel who kept men like him alive, and who, ironically, could also end them with clinical efficiency. "Look at her," Vance slurred, pausing his boast long enough to tilt his head toward the booth, his smile wide and malicious. "Reading a book in a bar. What is that, some kind of technical manual? Probably trying to figure out how to reset a network hub. God, the logistics teams are just drones." He punctuated this with a heavy, dismissive laugh, which his followers echoed obediently. One of the enlisted men, a corporal with too much cheap bravado and not enough common sense, decided to take the performance tactile. As he passed, returning from the bar with a fresh round, he didn't just bump the table. He reached out and snagged the corner of her paperback, ripping the last 3 pages clean off, the paper making a tiny, sharp sound, a sound that, in the context of the noise, was like a gunshot. Sergeant Reynolds remained still. She didn't flinch. Her breathing didn't hitch. The only response was the slowest, most deliberate lowering of her chin, bringing her face entirely into shadow. The sound of the paper tearing was the first violation of her deliberate non-existence. It was the moment the trespass moved from general annoyance to specific aggression. Vance noticed the torn pages, paused his monologue, and smirked. He saw it as successful intimidation. "Oops," he called out mockingly. "Looks like someone lost their bookmark. Maybe stick to romance novels, honey." The men laughed, loud and ragged. The jukebox thumped on, oblivious, playing a third-rate country song about heartbreak and pickup trucks. The bartender, a man named Sal, who had seen too many nights like this, meticulously avoided eye contact, wiping down the already clean surface of the bar with agonizing slowness. Reynolds' hand reached out, not to the torn paper, but to the untouched glass of bourbon. She didn't drink it. She simply closed her fingers around the rim, holding it as if it were a fragile piece of evidence. The movement was measured, surgical. She absorbed the insult, let the rage of the men wash over her, and processed it as data. The corporal, now truly feeling untouchable and fueled by 2 shots of cheap tequila, decided to deliver the coup de grace. He swaggered up to the booth, leaning in, his breath heavy with alcohol. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the fear, the shrinking, the apology. He reached out, quick and sloppy, and snatched the edge of the oversized hood, yanking it backward and down with aggressive force. The hood slid away, and the light hit her face. It wasn't a pretty revelation. It was devastating. The movement was abrupt, but her body remained utterly motionless. The contrast was immediate. Her hair was cut so tightly to her scalp it looked like dark velvet, a precise military fade that spoke of regulation and readiness. But it was her eyes that sucked the air out of the room. They were pale, a startling cold grey that seemed to absorb and refuse to reflect any light. They were deep-set and surrounded by an almost perpetual exhaustion, but the exhaustion was surgical. The kind that comes from weeks without sleep, performing tasks that require absolute precision. Her expression was neutral, yet the eyes themselves conveyed an infinity of danger. They were the eyes of someone who viewed the world in terms of angles, vulnerabilities, and kill zones. The corporal, his hand still lingering in the space where the hood had been, froze. His mouth opened to deliver a lewd remark, but the words caught in his throat like shards of glass. He hadn't revealed a lonely woman reading a book. He had revealed a predator waiting for the first sign of movement. Then she started to stand. This was the moment the world tilted. It was a slow-motion study in controlled physics. She didn't unfold, she ascended. The bar had been loud, chaotic, a symphony of drunken revelry. But as Sergeant Reynolds shifted her weight from the cheap vinyl seat to the sticky floor, the atmosphere fractured. The sound started to die. First, the conversation dropped out, a stuttering halt as the men near the pool table saw the change in posture, the sudden imposition of volume and definition she possessed. She wasn't exceptionally tall, maybe 5'8", but the sheer density of her musculature, honed for endurance and explosive short bursts of power, added an intimidating bulk that the baggy hoodie had completely concealed. The way she held her shoulders, relaxed yet poised like a tightly wound spring, was unnatural in this setting. The corporal backed up a single step, his eyes wide, recognizing the non-verbal cues taught in every basic combat school. Do not engage this target unless absolutely necessary. Vance, still mid-sentence, talking about his superior tactical insights, trailed off. His voice, once booming, now sounded thin and reedy. He watched her stand, and suddenly the starched crispness of his uniform felt like a costume. The jukebox, right in the middle of the chorus, seemed to hiccup. The mechanism momentarily failed, skipping a beat, then another, then settling into a deep, echoing silence. It wasn't intentional. It felt cosmic, as if the physical law of the tavern had to bend to accommodate her presence. The silence rushed in, thick and heavy, pressing down on every patron. It was the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath. In that vacuum, the only perceptible sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the labored, shaky breathing of the corporal who had pulled her hood. Sergeant Reynolds stood fully now, her hands resting at her sides. She didn't move towards them. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply existed. The silence amplified every detail of the environment she had just mastered. The bourbon glass on the table seemed immensely lonely. The torn pages looked grotesque, a violent interruption of order. Vance stared. He was trying to reconcile the image of the bookish girl he had mocked with the cold, lethal composure now dominating his vision. He was an officer. He had rank. He commanded respect. But this woman, she commanded something far more primal, survival instinct. He saw, for the first time, the subtle but definitive lines of scarring near her jawline, thin white trails that spoke of shrapnel or high-velocity entry. He saw the subtle, practiced tremor in her hands, not of fear, but of suppressed adrenaline, the body waiting for the command to mobilize. "Look, lady," Vance attempted, his voice a pathetic croak of its former self, trying to salvage the situation with a flash of perceived authority. "It was just a joke. We were having fun." Then Reynolds didn't respond to the words. She responded to the lie. Her gaze, that cold, pale grey, did not land on Vance's face, but on the corporal's trembling hand, still slightly raised from the action of pulling her hood. Her right hand moved. It was not fast, not flashy, but economical. The movement of someone who wastes zero energy. It picked up the small, worn paperback from the table. She looked down at the shredded spine, the 3 missing pages, and then back up at the corporal. She took one single measured step forward. Her boot hit the sticky floor, making a sound that felt like a gavel striking wood in an empty courtroom. Vance tried again, more forcefully this time. "Stand down, Specialist. I'm Lieutenant Vance. That's an order." The title meant nothing to her. Sergeant Reynolds, a special operator trained in environments where rank dissolved into competence, saw only weakness masked by insignia. Her eyes flickered briefly. A silent judgment passed on the man who demanded respect without earning it. She stopped directly in front of the corporal. She was close enough that he could smell the faint, metallic scent of gun oil clinging to her hoodie, even now that it was off. She didn't speak above a whisper, a voice so low and controlled that the surrounding tension drew every ear in the bar towards it. It was a voice honed by radio communication in hurricane conditions, clear, concise, and utterly devoid of emotional inflection. "You tore my property," she stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. The corporal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing violently. I didn't mean to. I apologize." "Apology accepted," she said, her voice remaining low. "However, the cost of an apology in this establishment is insufficient to cover the cost of trespass." Vance bristled, stepping closer, attempting to assert his physical dominance. "What the hell is that supposed to mean? Are you threatening an officer?" Sergeant Reynolds turned her head, just enough to acknowledge Vance, her eyes boring into him. In that moment, Vance wasn't an officer. He was an obstacle. He was soft, predictable, and slow. She redirected her attention back to the corporal. Her hand, holding the book, moved again. But this time, it didn't hold the book. It found the corporal's wrist, the one that had pulled her hood. The grip was not rough. It was absolute. It was the difference between a handshake and a vice. Before the corporal could register pain, before Vance could even form the first syllable of a warning, Reynolds executed a move so quick and compact it defied the visual perception of the rest of the bar. It was a wrist lock, a basic non-lethal compliance maneuver, except executed with the honed intent of a professional breaking down a door. A sharp, wet crack echoed in the total silence of the tavern. The corporal's arm went instantly limp, his face turning an ashen grey. He didn't scream. He couldn't. The shock had seized his vocal cords. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his now useless hand, whimpering shallowly. The bone hadn't just been broken. It had been dismantled carefully, precisely, ensuring maximum pain and minimum collateral damage to the surrounding environment. Yet Reynolds didn't even look down at the corporal writhing on the sticky floor. Her focus was entirely on Lieutenant Vance, who was now staring at the result of the action with pure, undiluted terror. The silence was deafening. The other patrons, who seconds ago were drunk and boisterous, were now statues, their eyes glued to the scene, suddenly realizing they were witnessing a shift in the hierarchy of power, not the staged dominance of the officer, but the earned lethal authority of the operator. Vance fumbled for courage, reaching for the authority he believed was his birthright. "That's assault! You're going to the brig! I swear, I will ruin your career!" Reynolds took her second step, closing the distance between them. She was within arm's reach. She looked past his eyes, past his chest, assessing the structural integrity of his collarbone. "My career is classified, Lieutenant," she whispered, her voice like ice grinding against steel. "And your threats are based on the assumption that you hold the power here." She leaned in, her proximity a physical violation that paralyzed him. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. Her presence was the weapon. "You rely on rank," she continued, every word landing like a surgical strike. "You rely on the insignia given to you by men who sit in climate-controlled rooms. You haven't earned the dirt on your boots, much less the authority you project." She paused, letting the truth sink into the panic blooming in his eyes. "I rely on physics," she concluded, her voice dropping lower still. "And right now, physics dictates that if I exert 1 Newton of force into your orbital socket, your life as you know it ends." She held the tattered paperback up, turning it slightly so he could read the title. "Military Logistics." "This isn't about supply lines," she said. "This is about knowing the weight, the trajectory, and the failure point of every single piece on the board." She lowered the book slowly, finally placing it back on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge. It was an act of complete control, signaling the end of the engagement. Vance was trembling, his rigid posture dissolving into a pathetic slouch. He saw his end, not in a grand military conflict, but in the sterile, efficient violence of a woman he had dismissed as a drone. He had called her a technician, and now she had demonstrated technical superiority over his very existence. Stuart Reynolds looked around the bar, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, the bartender wiping his brow, the pool players frozen mid-shot, the group of enlisted men who had been Vance's supporters suddenly desperate to melt into the shadows. She looked back at Vance, who was pale and sweating, unable to meet her gaze. The fear was beautiful in its purity. "The debt is settled," she announced, still in that low, controlled tone, ensuring only the people who needed to hear it did. "You will address the required medical attention for your subordinate, and you will ensure that when you speak of competence and authority, you first ensure you understand what true proficiency looks like." She didn't wait for a reply. She didn't swagger. She didn't make an example of Vance beyond the immediate, crippling humiliation. And Reynolds turned, retrieved her jacket, a worn leather bomber that had been carefully draped over the back of the booth, and put it on. The movement was fluid, graceful, the kind of movement taught only in specialized training programs where failure results in termination, not a reprimand. She walked towards the door, the heavy, deliberate cadence of her boots on the linoleum, the only sound slicing through the immense silence. She pushed open the door of the Rust Belt Tavern, stepping back out into the humid, indifferent night air. The silence held. No one moved. No one spoke. The Lieutenant Vance remained frozen, staring at the empty space where she had stood, his arrogance shattered, replaced by the crushing weight of realization. He had faced true violence, not the theoretical kind taught in classrooms, and he had been found catastrophically wanting. He had been taught a lesson in respect by a ghost. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Sal the bartender reached out and pressed the button on the jukebox, restarting the music. The country song blared back to life, attempting to recapture the atmosphere, but the effort was hollow. The noise couldn't fill the void left by her departure. The air in the tavern had changed its density forever. The only thing left was the corporal, whimpering softly on the floor, clutching his broken wrist, and the memory of the cold grey eyes of the operator, who demonstrated that in the world they truly inhabit, rank is just decoration, but skill is survival. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.